This might be the right time to point out that in ancient Greek, Pisa means marshy land.
Author Nicholas Schrady is well versed in Pisa's geology.
Most of the terrain in Pisa is essentially a former bog, a former swamp, and the subsoil in Pisa is extremely shifty and delicate, and it does not withstand heavy loads.
Sandy and soggy ground is definitely not ideal for tall, heavy towers, unless they have rock-solid foundations.
And this is the root of Pisa's problem. The tower's foundation is far from solid. The 57-meter-tall tower sits on supports that are only 3 meters deep and surrounded by soggy ground. Nowhere near strong or stable enough for a 14,500-ton pile of stone.
It's like building a tall tower on a sponge. It can only go so high before it's going to start leaning. In fact, it's a miracle it never collapsed.
The tower's tilt was enough to startle onlookers, but crucially, not enough to topple it. The original mistake occurred at the beginning of construction, but the tower survived for centuries. However, just a few decades ago, engineers came very close to bringing the tower to its knees once and for all.
Most of the attempts have failed, and those who most wanted to save the tower are really those who almost contributed to toppling it over. One of the most brutal interventions in the tower was conducted by Mussolini, and that intervention was about as brutal as fascist politics. He had the idea of boring 361 holes in the foundation and pumping it with 90 tons of cement. Mussolini also owned the cement factory, it should be said. The tower began to sway slightly out of control, but it's always managed to stabilize itself.
By 1990, the tower's lean had reached an angle of 5.5 degrees. Officials feared this icon would finally fall, and for the first time ever, it was closed to the public. They had every reason to worry.
Now, lots of ancient buildings, they do lean, but the Leaning Tower of Pisa just looks like it's defying the law of physics. And that's all to do with its centre of mass, which is just about here.
Experts calculate the tower's center of mass is around the 4th floor. As long as this sits above the base of the building, it will stand. But if it moves outside of that area, you have a disaster.
Calculations show that when the tower was at a lean of about 5.44 degrees, it should have collapsed. Now, by 1990, it was already at 5.5. It should have gone down. No one knows why it didn't collapse.
With so many rescue efforts over the centuries, the calculations of the lean have become confusing. To make matters worse, the lean compounds an issue hidden in the walls that could take the tower out before the lean knocks it over.
The greatest danger for the Tower of Pisa has not been that it should simply fall over because of its weight. There are other dangers as well, one of which is the incredible amount of stress which is produced on certain areas of the tower due to the weight of the tower.
The tilt strains the walls, which can be devastating to a structure built from solid stone. But while these look solid, the walls are filled with a random mix of building materials, making them less sturdy.
There has been a great concern that the tower would rather burst and implode rather than topple over.
Not only could the tower have fallen, it could have exploded at any point. It defies belief that it's still standing.
Back in 1990, with the icon threatening to fall, the world's best engineers rushed to save it, with almost catastrophic results.
What they first did was they bored holes down 40 meters into the bedrock and introduced steel cables to stabilize the tower. Now, in order to do that and not have the entire terrain become flooded with water, what they had to do was pump those boreholes with liquid nitrogen.
When you freeze the ground, you're also freezing the water contained within. And when water freezes, it expands.
And when the water thawed, the ground shrunk, causing the tower to rock back and sink as much in one night as in the previous year. Once again, this icon was close to collapse. Could engineers finally save the mighty tower? The team secured it with cables to prevent disaster, then went back to the drawing board. They came up with a solution that they hoped would finally stop the building from falling further.
Most solutions tried to help support the structure, but this just put more pressure on the ground underneath, making the problem worse. Eventually, wily engineers let gravity help out.
They had to start basically digging, drilling through into the soil, and they started removing really slowly the sand and a bit of the clay. So they created like a hill of clay nearby here, and then the tower started leaning a little bit less. So it became to lean now, it leans as it used to lean 2 centuries ago.
Digging under the tower turns out to have been a brilliant idea. It reduced the lean by about 10%, which, although that doesn't sound a lot, it brought the tower back from the brink.
It took more than a decade to complete the undermining fix, but in 2001, the tower reopened to the public.
Crucially, the angle was down to 4 degrees, well below the 5.44 limit, enough to prevent a collapse, for now.
In a way, the fact that the Tower of Pisa is located in the Campo dei Miracoli, or the Field of Miracles, strikes me as perfectly apt, because the tower should have toppled, in fact, centuries ago. And it hasn't. It goes on standing and will for 300 more years at least. And that, in a way, is a miracle.